G'day guys, in this video I'm going to be wiring up 5 floodlights. You can see one of them here on the front shining to the right. All up I'm going to have 2 shining right, 2 shining left and 1 reverse floodlight. All of the floodlights will be two-way, we'll be going through the two-way switching, and the reverse floodlight will be two-way, but it will also come on with a reverse trigger, and it will have a manual override to stop that reverse trigger turning it on, so you don't annoy the neighbours when you're in suburbia by having a very bright reverse light. Now the majority of this video will be going through the wiring, explaining how it all works with the assistance of this wiring diagram, one for the reverse floodlight which is more complicated, and the left and right hand side floodlights which is less complicated. I'll pop the wiring diagrams up on the screen as we go through it just so it makes a little bit more sense. On top of that we're going to be covering how to disconnect a Deutsch plug, how to terminate a Deutsch plug. I'm going to go through why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I'm doing it the way that I'm doing, as in two-way switching and reverse triggers and stuff like that. I'll go through the lights that I've chosen and why. I'll go through the brackets very briefly. I'm going to go through waterproofing of the entire system up top. I'm going to change out the junction box for a larger one. I'm going to be showing you where to pick up a reverse trigger in the BT-50 and the Ford Rangers, and we'll go through some relays, single pole, single throw, and even double pole, double throw as well. That will help make all of this work. And obviously all of the weights and costs will be included, as well as all the volt drop calculations and cable sizing, fuse selection, things like that. So let's get into it. So I'll be installing 5 ROC 20 Ultra Floods, and we'll just have a look at the website and I'll show you why. So I first saw these lights when I was walking through some four-wheel drive shops, and then I thought I'd look more into them. There's a few different options here: the 10, the 20, the 20 flood. So the 20 Ultra Flood is what I've got. We've got a spot. Now spotlights for me are no good. I wanted a wide beam for camping purposes. Now if we compare the flood and the Ultra Flood, so with the ROC 20 flood, 1 lux of light at 110 meters. With the Ultra Flood, we have 1 lux of light at 33 meters. So you can see the flood is leaning slightly towards spot. You get a greater distance, but as a camp light it would be more annoying for neighbouring campsites and stuff like that. And you can tell by the time this light has that spread of 27 meters off centre, it is 110 meters away, whereas with the Ultra Flood that spread happens at about 33 meters, so it's a wider angle beam, and this is better suited for what I wanted to use it for. The other reason I wanted this ROC 20 Ultra Flood is because of the claimed current draw of 0.9 amps. Because I am running cables that are quite long, because I'm using two-way switching, the volt drop does come into play. So by having the lowest possible power draw with a decent amount of light, it strikes that perfect balance for what I needed it for. So 5 of these onto these Rhino rack worklight brackets. These I picked up Black Friday as well, $24 each. I've already installed one for the reverse camera. That bracket will also be holding the reverse floodlight, so I've got 4 more of these to install. I'm also going to be changing the junction box that I had on the roof for this, which is larger, because there is quite a few joints to make and we've got quite a few cores to connect. These lights are handy as camp lights, so ideally you want them switched when the car is off. That's why they're powered from the lithium, and that is why I'm doing two-way switching, because you'd want to switch them from the Canopy. However, they can also be helpful when you're driving on a track and you want to light up the side of a track, hence the two-way switching to the front of the cab. So I'll have a right-hand side switch powering 2 lights on the right-hand side and a left-hand side switch. I'm also going to do a reverse switch, two-way switching, as well as the reverse trigger being the 3rd switch of sorts. And the only way I can achieve this is with a bunch of different relays, which we'll go through as we do it. The 5 lights, 1.786, 4 brackets, 1.689, nuts and bolts, 6.471, switches, relays, junction box, heat shrink, dual wall heat shrink, crimps, lugs, fuses, lugs, bootlaces, ring terminals, 3.870. So a box of connectors, some Deutsch connectors, glands, and some 5 amp fuses. Corrugated tubing, split and non-split. Cable, 6.308. This is some extra twin core 4mm. This is the Rhino rack worklight bracket. A few different mounting options, but generally this end is what goes in your strut, and that will be the case for me because I need extra length. I'll be using the rear hole. Now it does come with some M6 channel nuts, which I will not be using because I'll be using an M8 channel nut in the furthermost rear hole just to get some length out here. And then as for the mounting of the light itself, I can mount off the bottom, off the top. I'll change which way it's oriented on the bracket just to try to get as much light thrown out and not be blocked by the awnings. So with each light, there's not a lot to it. It comes with a 2-pin Deutsch plug and another 2-pin Deutsch plug, obviously the male and female end. And then this end you just join your cables to. And then in here are your mounting nuts and bolts and bracket. Now I'm just going to pre-mount these on all of the brackets and then mount them in position. And then I just need to make the connections into here afterwards. I don't need to access the light for electrical connections because everything's just done by the plug. So what we have for two-way switching is single pole double throw switches. What this means is that the feed or the switch wire will switch between pin 1 and pin 2. With a normal switch, it's simply on and off, so it only has a contact in one position. The other position is nothing or off. Now, there's not a whole lot to say about relays, but a normally open contact is two contacts that have no electrical connection, no continuity, until the coil of that relay is powered. Once the coil of that relay is powered, everything changes its state. So normally open becomes closed, normally closed becomes open. Using this and a multitude of different types of relays, you can get pretty fancy with some of the switching that you do. It allows you to switch things from larger power sources or even from different circuits. If you have a double pole relay, there's plenty of different options you can go with. So it's not overly confusing, just you're powering a coil. It's basically a switch that uses electromagnetism to go in and out or on and off, as opposed to your standard switch, which is a mechanical contact that switches on and off. So before I start running through the install, it might help if we just go through the wiring diagrams and the block diagrams that I've made for each of these three circuits. So on this layout drawing here, you can see this is kind of a bird's eye view. We have two floodlights on the right hand side, two on the left, and one reverse. Two on the left will be their own circuit. So we'll start with the right hand side and left hand side floodlights because they are less complicated. Now in the top left corner you see a wiring diagram, and basically the rest of the page is the block diagram. Where these differ is a wiring diagram is just a simple way of being able to follow the circuitry, make sure that everything will work the way you want it to work, but it doesn't tell you what cables you're running, where they're running to and from. It doesn't give you any physical sort of layout, so that's where the block diagram comes in. It's kind of the wiring diagram input into a physical location. And again, this is just a rough bird's eye view. You can see this dotted line up the top with cab written on it. Those two switches in there are in the cab. They are from this switch panel here. Now you can see I've put the stickers on, right hand side and left hand side. So we've got our right hand side two-way. So these are single pole double throw switches, the common switches between pin 1 and pin 2. These are completely different circuits, and you can see this part that I've lined here, I've written down that I need 6 cores. So I'll be running 7 cores and I'll have 1 spare core. The Blue Sea Safety Hub 150 is this. This is where all the feeds come from, and this is where all the neutrals land to on this negative bus bar here. As you can see in the wiring diagram, you have a feed switch, which just has a feed to the common. Then you have 2 rockovers or strappers or whatever you want to call them, but it's literally just 2 cores that run from one single pole double throw switch to another single pole double throw switch. In this instance, they are joined at the junction box and then just extended out. Now the other switch, as you can see in the wiring diagram, and you can also see on the block diagram, it is called a switch wire switch. This common feeds to the positive of the light. So one switch has the feed, the other one goes to the light. Then we just have our negative returns, which in my case go to the Blue Sea Safety Hub 150, which has a negative buzz bar. So it might look a little bit complicated, but this is really basic. We're just running two-way circuits side by side. Now in the bottom left corner, I've just written a little note to myself about which colour of the 7-core trailer cable does what, because I pre-wired this headboard months and months ago now, there's no way I would ever remember that. Now what this does, it allows me to see how many cores are needed in between each different item or component. For example, from the canopy to the junction box, from the cab to the junction box, from the junction box to the light. Now it is worth noting that I've since changed this. I'm running one cable to each light. I'm not looping at the light on the left or at the light on the right. I'm running single cables. So the ROC 20 Ultra Flood has a claimed amperage of 0.9 amps. Because we have 2 on the circuit, that's 1.8 amps. For the volt drop calculations, I just worked it off 2 amps. The longest path that I can see, and this is where two-way switching adds to volt drop, is 19 meters, because we have to go from the feed through the two-way into the cab and then back through the junction box out to the furthest light on this circuit will be the rear right hand side, and then we have to include the negative return all the way through the junction box back into the canopy and onto that negative buzz bar. I've worked it out roughly as about 19 meters, that entire loop. It might be 1 or 2 meters longer or shorter. I've used 2 amps instead of 1.8. 0.0185 is the copper resistivity at 40 degrees, divided by 1.85, which is our cable size in millimeters squared. We get 0.38, divide that by 13 times 100, and we're looking at 2.924% voltage drop on this circuit. Okay, so that's the two-way switching circuits, the basic ones. We got right-hand side flood and left-hand side floods, separate circuits, but they do share the same 7-core trailer cable from the junction box to the cab. Okay, so now we'll be looking at the reverse light, and this one is a little bit more complicated. It took me a while to figure out how I wanted to do it. So again, top left, we have the wiring diagram, and this basically lets me know that something will work the way that I want it to work. And then the right hand side of the page is our block diagram. So you can see I've got the engine bay up the top, the Blue Sea Safety Hub 150. I am no longer running that negative cable of the coil into the engine bay. I have a chassis connection closer in the cab. This will be a little bit different to how it's shown. In the middle here, you got DPDT R1. That stands for double pole, double throw relay. What this means is we have normally open contacts, normally closed contacts, and they are completely separate. It is not one feed coming in that changes from a normally open to a normally closed. They are two completely separate feeds that I can run to this relay. Got an isolation switch. And then we have our single pole double throw two-way switch. That is in this switch panel here. You can see with the light sticker facing backwards. Now going from the cab to the junction box, I've circled there 5 cores to the cab. We are running a 7-core trailer cable, so we'll have 2 spare cores as well as 1 spare core from the left and right hand side floodlights, so 3 spare cores total. Now this large middle section is inside the canopy. We have our feed from the Blue Sea Safety Hub 150, and our feed actually goes to a switch on the left hand side in the canopy, which I'll show you now. It's just on the headboard in this gap between the fridge. Now the block diagram here might look a little bit complicated, and I guess it kind of is, but head over to the wiring diagram and I'll just highlight out the circuits given a number of different scenarios that we might be in. So in essence, here's our two-way switching here, and what we're switching is not the light, but we're switching the R1 coil. So we have a feed to our feed switch on the two-way, and then we have our switch wire end. But you'll notice we're not two-weighing the actual light, we're two-weighing the R1 coil. So we're two-weighing a double pole, double throw relay. This double pole, double throw relay has a normally open down the bottom here. That is a constant feed, but obviously when that R1 relay is inactive, it has no continuity to the light. The feed also splits off to R2, which is normally open. So again, it has no feed to the reverse light. So the reverse light is off. When we flick either of those switches, the R1 coil becomes activated. This R1 and C up the top becomes open, but R1 and O closes, and now our light is on. So we are technically two-weighing the light on and off in the cab and in the canopy via this double pole, double throw relay. Now, the R2 coil is going to be triggered by reverse, which I'll pick up from the tail lights. That is a normally open. Now just imagine we put the car into reverse. We have continuity through the R1 normally closed, and then through an isolator switch to the light itself. So if the isolator switch is in the on position, then that is our reverse trigger working. But if we're driving around and we want to turn that off, we can isolate that by flicking that switch. Now if you have the light in reverse and you flick the switch on manually, the R1 NC will become open and our feed will go through the R1 normally open as it was before. And you'll notice our feed from the canopy and cab overrides the isolation switch. The reason for this is if we have that isolated so it doesn't come on with the reverse trigger, we still want to be able to switch it from the canopy if we're accessing the trundle drawer at the back. We don't want to have to go into the cab to flick that isolation switch just to get the light on at the back once we've pulled up. The isolation switch is only relevant for the reverse trigger. So all of that, what it gives us, it's quite convoluted, but we have full manual control from either switch, regardless of what position that isolation switch is in. When we want to stick it into reverse, we can still isolate that. But as soon as we go out of reverse, that R2 coil is unenergized, which means R2 normally open becomes open again, and our reverse light is off. So it is switched by reverse, it is switched manually, and we can isolate the reverse switch. Now if we look at the voltage drop calculations for this, it is a longer run. This is why I've only put one light on this circuit. I estimate that the maximum run is about 24 meters. I used 1 amp and 0.0185 again. This is 0.24. Divide that by 13, times it by 100. We have 1.846% volt drop using our 1.85mm cable. One thing I want to point out, which I did unknowingly, which I picked up on as I was doing the diagram, is I have actually run 2 feeds up into this junction box. So although I have 2 spares, in theory if I wanted to change it I could actually have 3 spare cores in there, because there is a double up in the feeds running from the cab up to the junction box. I'm going to leave it as a double feed in parallel because I have no interest in taking the headboard off, and all it does is lower the voltage drop because that portion of cable is technically thicker. These are relays. This is an ignition relay. This is a dash light relay. I will also be putting my double pole, double throw relay in here. These relays get hidden behind this switch panel when everything goes back together. My reverse light isolation switch I have not drilled yet, but it will go here somewhere next to a winch isolator switch, which I'll drill at the same time. And then the rest of the 7 core will connect to this switch panel here. Plenty of places to start with a job like this, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mount all the lights and I'm going to run all the cables around the top of the canopy back to that junction box, waterproof everything up, and then that portion of it is done. In order to keep the cable run as short as possible, as well as make as few joins as possible, instead of looping, for example, to this front right hand side and then having a cable join here going back across to the rear right hand side, what I'm going to do is have one cable from the junction box to each light. So there won't be any loop in, loop out. This means I have less connections being made, and it also means I'm using less cable. Now the less cable length, it's better for volt drop. The less joins we make, the easier it is to waterproof everything, and the less cable we use, the cheaper and lighter weight it is as well. An added benefit of this is that the Deutsch connector can just be hardwired straight into it. We remove the old pins, re-terminate with some new pins, and we have a nice solid system with no inline joints at all. I'm going to run a twin core 4mm to each light from the junction box. That is where all the joins will be made. So there's only one join through the system of the canopy portion of the roof. Here is an example of a setup that I will have. I will have the rear right hand side with a cable tied through there. The plug itself will be cable tied to the extrusion, and then you can see I've directly terminated my cable, which will run out to that junction box. What we have here is a waterproof plug, dual heat shrink over the outer sheath breakout to the single cores, and then obviously the dual heat shrink from the non-split corrugated tubing onto that outer sheath. So I've mounted all of the brackets now, and I've mounted all of the floodlights. There's not really a whole lot to say about the mounting of the floodlights, but make sure you have this bolt through the bracket before you put the light on the bracket. That bolt does not come through the bracket when the light's there. So all of them I've mounted on the bottom of the bracket. Greater flexibility to shine down. That is where the rear right is facing at the moment. The reverse light might get angled down more. We'll just see what it looks like. The rear left and the front left. So this is a Deutsch connector. All of the Rock 20 lights come with this style of connector. This is a waterproof connector. This is the female end. The male end is hardwired into the light. Now this cable supplied is 1.5mm and they have a pre-stripped end you can join here to make inline joints. So what I've decided to do is to remove these cables and attach my cables directly. And the reason is because it just gets rid of one joint in the system, keeping in mind that I already have quite a few joints because I've pre-wired the headboard and they're also going up to a junction box. So by eliminating this, it just makes the connection more direct. Now to do that, we need a small flathead in here. This orange face here is called a wedge. So we want to pry that out without ruining this waterproof seal here. This helps seal on the male plug. So that comes out. In here are your two plugs, and it might be a bit hard to see. There are two levers in there that we need to press on as we pull the cable back. Again, with the same size screwdriver, nice and small. Now you have your pins out. This is a waterproof seal on the back. We'll hold on to that because we'll reuse it. Now these pins themselves we cannot reuse, but what you can do is head down to Jaycar, buy a 6-way Deutsch connector. Comes with 6 pins, male and female. We want the female ones for what we're doing. Basically, buy as many as you want. If you ruin one of these, go buy a 2-way Deutsch connector. They're not too expensive. Comes with the pins we need, and we can re-terminate it. We have a direct connection into the plug, and we have the best electrical connectivity as possible. So here's the Deutsch plug that we disconnected before. All we need is cable. Now this is a pre-cut length. I'm just doing it here because it's easier to show you. So this is where I put a little bit of dual heat shrink over. This will cover that change from the twin sheath to the single core. Now when we strip these ends, we need them to be the exact same length. So there is no pressure on the cable inside the plug. It just sits there. From our 6-way Deutsch plug or whatever you've got, we just want to take out the female connectors. So there we have 2 female connectors. You can see with the ones that we've disconnected, there's a very short amount of copper stripped back. Then we have one part of the crimp folded over onto that, and then the rear part folds onto the insulation. I'll be using these ratchet crimps from Nava. These are not official Deutsch ones, but you can make them work. You can see how they only have one side of crimp. That's because we only need a really thin crimp on these. I will be crimping it twice, but I'll just move the ratchet head across as I go to crimp each bit. The double crimp ratchet head is a little bit too thick. That is what it looks like, and then the lug will go in there and that will close it up, and you'll see as it hits the curved face opposing it, it will actually bend it back over and crimp it into the cable. The bit that looks like the letter M, the cable will be in there, and this crimp will bend that over onto the cable to make a nice crimp. We don't need a lot of length. See if I can do them at the same time so they are the same length. Now we have the cable in there, and you can notice the rear crimp is over the insulation. The forwardmost crimp will crimp over the copper. The other thing you can do is pinch these inwards if it's not going to quite line up with your crimp. So I'll have that bit there. Now I'm just going to squash those closer together so it fits in the die better and definitely curves over on itself. So there you have it, bent over on itself. Nice firm connection. I can't actually pull that apart. Now I do the same on the rear one onto the insulation. And again, I just like to pinch it in a little bit. And with the insulation one, I actually start on the next largest die back. And once it's bent over and has a nice bend to it, then I'll move forward to the forward crimp and crimp it again. That's just because it is a little bit wider set in those jaws. So that is it after the large crimp, and that is it after the final crimp. Now I do the same with the red, make sure the pins are the same length, and then I'll show you how to put it back together. Now we have both of our crimps here, and what we want to do when we put them back in the Deutsch connector is make sure we have our polarity correct. So all we need to do is match it to the existing ones that come with the lights. We need to remove this rear seal, slide this over our new connection. This is where you want to make sure your dual heat shrink's on first. Now, depending on how you look at it, you can notice these holes aren't in the middle. With the top end, the active is on the left. The top end is actually this bit, because that's where it sits. That long flat bit is where the wedge will sit. So that is correct once we flip this, with red on the left. Now you have your cables in. We need to slide that wedge in. Get a nice solid click there, and that is your wedge complete. Push this rear seal in to complete the waterproofing. Now to try to get a waterproof seal here, ideally you'd have these cores together and not spread apart. So we're not trying to drill or heat shrink right to the end, because that will not close. The plug is forcing them apart. We want to try and close it up where they are joined. So just a little bit like that with some exposed cable there. So that's how you refit off and disassemble a Deutsch plug. Now the 2-7 cores are run up from the junction box down here. I haven't tied them in yet because I still have to tap into the reverse, which goes to the junction box. They go in through that grommet. They come in here with the antenna and the reverse camera cable. These holes here are where the shim clips into, and with protection on, it's covering that hole. So I'm just going to have it hard up against here, and obviously it can't be stepped on because this is a metal ridge, so it's nice and safe in there. I'll just have it hard up against that ridge, and it's also double insulation. There is an outer sheath, and each core has its own sheath or insulation, so double insulated still. I've drilled holes in the top of this center storage compartment, and then I've just got a long length out here. That'll go to the back of that switch panel there. Alright guys, so now we're up to the reverse part of the wiring. So what we're looking for here is a reverse trigger, something that comes on 12 volts when the car's in reverse, and then obviously turns off again when the car is in any position other than reverse. Now what we're connecting to that is the coil of the relay. So every time the car goes into reverse, the coil closes. This is a normally open relay, so there is no contact. Coil goes in when car's in reverse, we have contact, and then that circuit fires off to the reverse floodlight. So I'll show you the wiring now on the diagram. You've got the feed that comes out. It is stopped by the relay being normally open, so it is not powering the light. When we go into reverse, then we are powering the light. That's basically all it is. Now for your car to find a reverse trigger, the easiest place to go is to the tail lights, or if you have a trailer plug, you can pick up a reverse feed from there. In this car, I've got a 7-pin flat, so the earth, if I want to pick up an earth, a good connection rather than going to the chassis. The earth is in the middle, it's white, and on the socket, the right-hand side will be a black, and that is my reverse. Now, although this is universal, I actually put the multimeter on just to confirm that it was wired correctly, so I have confirmed that that is correct for the trailer plug. But I've also disconnected the rear lights here on the canopy. We're connected with a Deutsch plug. I disconnected it and I tested that live as well, putting the car into reverse and finding my reverse light feed that came on at 12 volts. So all you need to do is find that 12 volt feed, hook it up to either the 85 or the 86 of the relay, then the other end obviously has to go to ground. I'll be connecting to an actual cable ground, not just onto the chassis. Now luckily for me, behind the canopy there's actually a pre-existing join for all of the canopy lighting at the back of the car. So all I've had to do is untape that and make those 2 points accessible, and then I'll just add to that joint. Now for the cable that is being controlled by the relay, I've run a 2-core from the roof, the junction box, down the firewall between the cab and the canopy, and then out along across the chassis. I've cable tied that to the existing trailer loom that comes out the back and all the tail light wiring. So we'll jump underneath and I'll show you what we're working with. So this is a pre-existing join. Now I've already gone and tested this, but I have my reverse feed and my earth connection here. So I'll be connecting to that. I have this cable 2-core that I've run in from the junction box. That runs along here all the way to in between the cab and the canopy, and then it goes up. Now on the underside of the canopy, we have this strut system to give strength to the floor. What I've done is just put some channel nuts in here, and the reason being is I want to be able to tie the cable up to there The next strap forward is another channel nut, and I'm going to have an M6 bolt through there, tying the relay like that with the cables tied to that channel nut. Now what this means is the weight of the cables isn't fighting its way off those pins with gravity and vibrations as we drive. Because it's horizontal and the cables are secured with a cable tie here, they won't try and work themselves off the pins. They should be nice and secure. Now because we are under the car, I've tried to get a sealed relay, so you can see around the pins there is a form of sealing. Now this is not rated IP anything. They don't claim to be IP67 or 68, but it does have some sort of sealing to allow it some better weatherproofing, but I wouldn't claim that it's fully waterproof. So this is a 5-pin variant, so we have 2 pins for the coil. We have our feed in, and then we have 2 normally open contacts. I'm only using the one, but there is another one there just in case I need it. But it is single pole, it is not double pole, so you only have the one feed switching to 2 outputs. You don't have separate poles. So this should be fine up here. It is quite out of the way and quite protected, and hopefully never submerged, because the height of this canopy floor is at least a metre off the ground, if not a tiny bit more. So from this join, there'll be 2 cores, reverse positive and negative, up to the relay coil. Then we have our 2 core from the junction box that'll go up to the relay. So here's what it looks like. I haven't taped up the relay and the contacts because I want it to be able to dissipate heat. I've cable tied it twice so it doesn't try to work its way out, and here is the old joint all taped up. So I have finished the junction box terminations. There's not really much to say about it. You're basically using your drawings. You're connecting the colours, following the path through, making sure everything goes to the right place. Now this is where the labelling is very important, because if you've labelled something wrong as you run it in, then none of this will work. I'm using connectors rather than solder. Connectors are more easily serviceable, but also the join that you make for a solder or a connector is the same. So if these connectors for some reason vibrated loose, all I need to do is pull that off and solder it and it's done. But this is easier for if I ever want to add something to it in the future. I have some spare cores just taped up. I've labelled everything quite roughly, but in white tape. So the tape obviously holds the cores together, so there's no pressure on the actual join, but it also lets me label everything for future reference. Bit of silicone on these elbow joins, just because the shoulder of the gland wasn't really thick and it started pulling itself in through the hole, and it is more exposed than the bottom entry. So I've siliconed up there, bottom ones are fine, and that's basically it. Let's put all this back together. So now all that's left to do is to terminate this switch panel and put the fuses in and start testing it. So our double pole, double throw switches are these 3 white ones here. The 2 on the outside will be our rockovers or strappers, whatever you want to call them. 2 isolation switches, one for the reverse, one for the winch, one green, one blue. It's just a single pole, single throw switch, so we have our common, our load, and then an earth for the little illumination light. My relays at the back of the switch panel. This negative was meant for the double pole, double throw relay, but I've actually used the wrong size blade. So I'm just going to go terminate this, make everything neat enough to push back behind the switch panel. So one of the great benefits of having all these spare cores is that I've looped my UHF feed here before it goes up to the unit, and what this allows me to do is, currently it's just constant power from the starter battery. I can change it to ignition power from the starter battery, or using these spare cores, I can actually hook it up to the lithium so it doesn't drain the starter battery if I wanted to. Okay, so I've wired up the back of the switch panel. All the cables just go to exactly where they're drawn, and we've got our double pole, double throw relay here. Now, I've taped all them together just so they're not trying to bend outwards on these tabs. That double pole, double throw relay takes mini blade fuses. It's not quite thick enough. You actually need to pinch these in with pliers to get a proper grip, otherwise they just slide off. All of these spade terminals had to be pinched with pliers, and it's a bit of a balancing act between not pinching too tight, because you can't get them on, and pinching it just right. Okay, so I haven't filmed all this bit because it's literally just me following this drawing. We've got our 2 cores here to the 2-way switch, or the single pole double throw switch. We've got these 2 cores that go to the double pole double throw relay, And then these two that go from the relay to the isolation switch are just extended with the same colour, whatever it was on the other side. We've got one core that goes straight to the isolation switch, and then we've got these other cores here we just have to make up from the common of the single pole to the double pole double throw relay coil. Okay, good news is that all the wiring is done now. All I need to do is put some fuses in and test it. Just a correction to what I said before, the reverse light is not on its own circuit. It is on the same circuit as the right hand side floods, but they are separate feeds up to the J-box and everything, so the volt drop calculations are the same, but they are fused together. I'll be fusing both circuits with 5 amps. The total should be about 2 amps and 3 amps, and that gives plenty of headroom there with the 5 amp fuse, but it's not so big that it is endangering the cable. The cable being 1.85mm can handle probably 25 amps or even higher possibly, so there's no danger with that 5 amp fuse. Now after I fuse it, I'm going to turn the lights off in here, and I'm going to go through the manual switching, make sure the manual switching works, but at the same time I'm just going to look at how much light it actually outputs. I won't change the orientation, rather do that when I'm out in the open somewhere so I can see how it throws itself on the floor properly. In the garage it's just going to hit the walls and rebound a bit. I'm interested in how much light gets thrown out, but it won't be a proper test until I'm out in the open somewhere. On top of that, I'm going to put a clamp meter on the main power cable in there and just see what the actual power draw is and see if it lines up with the claimed power draw. Okay, so the fuses are in. I'm just going to trial out this right hand side. So it's good, they work. Like I said though, I can't really get a proper idea of the spread of light until I'm in an open space. The two-way switching from the cab. Now the left hand side, so pretty decent. This is the awning side, so this is where everything will be set up. It does kind of throw past the canopy a little bit. It's hard to show, but there is a slight V-shape on the floor here, but it does actually throw relatively central, and we've always got these lights to fill this area. And we'll check the two-way. Cool, two-way switching is working. So the reverse light, and from the cab, now I am flicking the isolator switch, but it doesn't do anything, and that's exactly what we want. So I've angled it slightly down so I can see in the trundle drawer when that comes out, but also obviously it's for reversing in dark situations to see trees and stuff like that. Pretty happy with the spread that this is giving as well. I'm definitely happy I went with the ultra flood to get more spread than the floods, which are a bit more narrow. Now we need to turn the car on and test the actual reversing function and the reverse relay, make sure that works, as well as the isolator. Put the car in reverse. With that switch in the on position and the car in reverse, we have light. Take the car out of reverse and it goes off. So if you're happy with that light on all the time, you can leave it like that. Otherwise, you can isolate by turning the switch off. Now, if we put it in reverse, there is no light. Leave it in that position for automated reverse trigger. Otherwise, you have full manual control, which just switches the relay and overrides it, so it doesn't matter what position this is in if you've got that manual control on. So that's all good, that's operating as intended. That comes on with my lights. I've got a dash light relay in there powering those, and you can see this light does get brighter, but I will just have a look, see if I can get these to turn off properly. With the dash light, I'd like them to be off completely and then on when I switch the dash light, so I'll have to look and try and fix something there. Just going to do a check between the red arc and this bad boy. So I just want to check the amp draw. So for the two lights on the right hand side, I'm picking up 2.07 amps on the clip-on ammeter and 2.2 amp for the red arc red vision. Now I'll just check on the reverse light. The reverse light is giving us 1.11 amps. And the left-hand side lights, 2.14. So they're all pretty consistent. They're a little bit higher than advertised, but because of volt drop, the lithium will have to output a little bit more than what the light needs to account for the volt drop. So I do believe that the true power draw of the lights is probably as advertised. It will be about 0.9 amps. So if I put all 5 on, so 5 lights, 5.28 amps, pretty good result. Red Vision is telling me that with 52% of my battery left. I could last 11 hours with these 5 lights on. So a couple hours at night in camp with only one side shining, it's not going to drain the battery down too bad at all. That was part of the appeal with these lights, is the 1 amp power draw. Now with the junction box and everything else, 0.592 relay switches, etc. The lights added 1.315 kilos. Split and non-split tubing, we've added 279 grams. The brackets, 4 of them that I mounted, is 1.052 kilos. All my cable was 2.5 kilos, just over. The nuts and bolts that I added, 0.213. And then the J-box that I removed and some other stuff. Total weight added to the car, 5.78 kilograms. Alright, so that's the 5 floodlights. We got 2 on the right, 2 on the left, both 2-8 from the cab and the respective side of the canopy, right or left hand side. Got a reverse floodlight that comes on with a reverse trigger, but you can isolate it, but the isolator doesn't interrupt you turning it on from the canopy or the cab. So I'll have to wait till I've got the car outside at night to see how well the lights throw and how good the spread is. 3 of the lights are mounted slightly inboard of their extrusion that it's mounted to because of the shower awning on the right hand side front and the 270 degree awning mounting brackets on the left hand side front and rear. The rear right hand side light is mounted to the far edge of the extrusion, which is better, but I'll wait and see how good the throw is, how wide the beam is at night time before I make any changes to the way the lights are oriented or positioned. Either way, the cable length is there for any little small changes that I want to make. Really happy with the power draw of all of these and just the look of it. I think it looks nice and neat. I like the Deutsch plugs. Nice hardwired cable into the light. Everything looks nice and neat. Everything's weatherproof. So we've just seen all the weights, price list up here for all the other components that haven't been covered in other videos, like non-split tubing, any extra crimps or lugs that I might have purchased, fuses, etc. So hopefully that didn't seem too confusing. At the end of the day, being able to follow that diagram is all that really matters, because your car will be set up differently. You'll have a different switch panel, you have a different isolation switch mounting method, or whatever the case might be. As long as you can follow that wiring diagram and get your cables from point A to point B for whatever your setup is, then it should work exactly the same. Everything worked fine for me first go. The key is really good labeling. Make sure you label everything, even if you think you'll remember, just write it down somewhere, white tape, label it, because if you don't get back to it for a few weeks or months like I have, then it is the difference between everything working or you spending hours fault finding. So hopefully this has been of some help and you can implement this sort of setup or a similar sort of two-way setup with your car. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. So in this video I'm going to cover the terminations of the floodlights, why I chose what I chose, the mount, explaining how it ever, and also how to terminate, because these lights, so the feed from, and the reverse right. Alright, so there you got it, 5, there you got it.